Hello, today we're going to talk about the 8 factors which allowed the colonists to win the American Revolutionary War against the British. These will be something that you'll need to know for a little bit later on one of your assessments. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is home field advantage. So think back to the time period of the American Revolutionary War. There's not as much access to maps. There's not really a lot of intelligence as far as where things are located, especially if you're coming from the British side and you might not know about some of the little details like where a creek might be or the quickest road to get to a particular city. One very specific example that we talked about was as the British marched down the Hudson River, they didn't realize how heavily forested it was, how difficult it would be to move all their troops. So just a lot of things that the colonists knew about the geography, about the weather, that the British did not particularly know about. All right, the second thing is superior arms technology. Now, we did mention at the beginning of the war the British did have a little bit more advanced technology with weapons. As the war goes on, though, the Americans begin developing their own rifles. These are going to be much more accurate than the muskets. And towards the end of the war, the Americans actually had a little bit better technology than the British, mostly in the aspect of rifles. So, rifles you can shoot further, you can be more accurate. There's going to be a little bit of a difference between the muskets and the rifles. The Americans begin producing their own rifles. Number three is better leadership. There's a difference in how the leaders are chosen in the Patriot Army compared to the British regular army. A lot of the British regular officers were there largely because of bloodlines, who their parents were, who their grandparents were, if their father had been a general in the British Army. So that was kind of how the British selected their officers. In many cases, maybe that wasn't the best way to find the best person. In America, it was largely based on merit. A great example is Henry Knox. Henry Knox was a bookseller, but he happened to know a lot about artillery. When Washington needed to put somebody in charge of artillery, he picked the person that he believed was the most knowledgeable, had the most experience, and that happened to be Henry Knox. It wasn't based on his family or any potential connections that he had to people with authority or prominence. So a little bit better as far as picking leaders as far as the Patriots go. Fourth, think a little bit about how the British had a 3-month voyage to get information or supplies from England to the colonies. It's really hard to fight a war if you've got about a 3-month delay in getting information or being able to get supplies there. So the Americans had a definite advantage in fighting in their own territory, on their own homeland. So just the supply lines were a lot for the British to overcome. Number five is the vast size of the American theater of war. So as you talk about different conflicts and wars, a lot of times the place where the war is fought, they call a theater of war. So the entire theater of war for the American Revolutionary War was the colonies. So when you look at the size difference just between the 13 colonies compared to the entire mother country of England, there's a huge discrepancy. The American colonies are a very, very large territory. So as the British are fighting the Americans, they're going to have to control all of that land as they begin to control it. So we talked about how they have a very powerful navy. They can go up to a coastal city and control that coastal city with the ships they have. But once you start to go inland, and then you have to spread out soldiers, and you have to start being able to control, hundreds and hundreds of square miles of land, that becomes very difficult for the British to do. So the Americans don't have to really necessarily force the British to do anything. The British have to force us to eventually surrender. That causes them to have to control territory, and it's just too much territory for them to control. Number six, the British never really fully adapt to the different tactics that are being used in the North American theater. The British want to continue to fight as they have in European wars, which is kind of very well organized in big chunks and blocks. There's kind of like rules of warfare. The Americans start fighting with guerrilla warfare, as we've talked about, really small, quick attacks, hiding. There's just different things that the Americans do. And the British never fully adapt to these tactics. And so that's definitely a downfall for them. Number seven, the British are unable to mobilize the loyalists throughout the war. There are plenty of loyalists in the colonies. If you remember back to that statistic we talked about, they estimate that there might have been, almost like 30% of the patriots were loyalists. The problem the British have is they never really find a way to organize them. So on the patriot side, we talked about how the Sons of Liberty, for example, were a way for the people that were fighting against the British in Boston to kind of organize and talk about how they were doing different protests or talk about how they had different militias set up. The British never really come up with a system to kind of communicate and network all of these loyalists. So even though there's a lot of loyalists throughout the colonies, they never really become a factor in the war. And the British just never really crack a way to mobilize all of those individuals. And then the last one, just kind of real simply, the British underestimate the colonists. Just throughout the entire war, the British never really fully respect the potential of the colonial army. They think that they're unorganized, they think that they are not professional soldiers, which is all true. But as the war goes on, they gradually become better and better at realizing what they need to accomplish as an army. We talked recently about Valley Forge. That was a great an example of how the American Patriot Army began to learn how to fight and began to learn how to become a better army. And then once that spring came after Valley Forge, they were much better at using a bayonet, marching in different formations, being able to communicate with their leaders on the battlefield, things like that. So even up through the end of the war, the British in many ways don't really feel like the Americans have the potential to be able to defeat them. And they're almost kind of stunned to a certain degree that the American army is able to win the battles that they're able to eventually win the war. So a combination of those 8 major factors is what allows the Patriots to win the American Revolutionary War.